Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Scanning and Tossing webinar. My name is Leslie Coziera, and I'm a Certified Records Manager for Washington State Archives. And welcome again, and let's just get right into the imaging requirements for paper-based records. We still get, in this day and age, a number of calls and emails about people wanting to go paperless, so we'll talk about that a little bit this morning. Can you scan and toss? We'll answer that burning question. We'll talk about what are the rules and requirements about imaging, and we'll talk about what are the rules and requirements about getting rid of the paper. Who should know these requirements? Well, any public agency that wants to scan paper-based records and then destroy the paper originals once they've imaged. And we also like vendors to know these rules and requirements. If you have a vendor that is looking to do some imaging and scanning projects on a major scale for you, make sure they're aware of some of the things that Washington State requires in order for them to perform to their utmost and make sure that you're protected. I like to talk about some definitions going in. Like I mentioned before, I do still get questions or concerns or just a proclamation that we're going paperless. And I'd like to gently have a conversation about what they mean by that. What we think in this office about going paperless means that you're doing exactly that. You have no intention of generating any paper. Anything you create in a piece of software and application does not get printed out. Going paperless does not mean scanning and tossing the paper. If you're still creating paper-based records as part of your business processes and procedures, you are not going paperless. Going paperless actually means that you are developing your processes and are starting to implement completely electronic processes from start to finish. What that means is that you're not generating any paper, you're not distributing any paper, you're not printing any paper copies, you're not requiring hard copy signatures or wet signatures anymore. All your transactions take place within a digital format. And there's several ways you can do that. I mean, you can use e-forms, you can use databases, you can use electronic approvals and signatures. There's a whole plethora of things you can do in order to go completely paperless. We just like people to understand the difference between the terms. Truly going paperless means exactly that. No paper's generated, nothing sees the light of day as a piece of paper, and everything's being done in a true digital format. That does require some planning, however. And you don't need our permission, you don't need consultation from us. You absolutely can do business completely electronically as much as you want. Make sure, though, that you've got some records management attached to some of those processes. Because no matter what format you're dealing with, public records need to meet all those other requirements, no matter what, as necessary for your business. And that includes legal, audit, access, retention, disposition, and the whole schmear. And it's a good idea that you start documenting the decisions and the actual implementation. You know, make a proclamation or write a policy that from this day forward, this is how you're doing that bit of business. And another thing to consider when you are looking at going paperless, and let's face it, it's just the way the world is going. How many of you still get paper-based financial statements from your bank? I mean, a few people still do, but the reality is more and more processes you're being asked to go online. You're being asked to go paperless. It's a reality, it just is. And we have no objection to that whatsoever. We just actually ask people, can you please make sure your records management and public records requirements are being considered as you move forward into that world. Scanning and tossing is actually a really good way to bridge that gap. So many agencies still have either a paper-centric or a heavily paper-oriented process. And there's a great desire to want to transition from that hybrid structure where you're still dealing with some paper, but you're also having to, consider the electronic processes, to go completely electronic start to finish. And that's okay. I also like to discuss the terms born digital versus digitization. There's still a little bit of confusion between those two terms and in relation to scanning and tossing. Imaging, or what they call digitization, is actually converting a piece of paper or a paper-based record through a physical process. You're scanning it, you're digitizing it, you're imaging it to a digital format. And let's face it, digital formats are great. And your incidence of paper cuts have gone down dramatically because things can now be searched and located in a digital format. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about imaging or digitization. The term born digital means it started life. It was created from the beginning using a software application. Now, there are several instances. Sometimes, yeah, you use a software piece of application or a software application to create records right, left, and center. Those are born digital. But if your transaction of business actually takes place from a printed format of that record, say you print something out, a contract, and you still require a wet signature, that execution of business is that printed out piece of paper. Let's talk about that a little bit more. For example, we have a lot of boards and commissions that are still kind of using the hybrid approach to their business. They'll draft official minutes in Word, and then at the meeting, the chair signs the printed minutes at the next meeting. It's approved. The signature is officially approving that bit of business. That bit of business then occurs in paper. That's your official record. That's your execution of business. The Word document sitting on your server is a draft. Now, we do have some boards and commissions who actually will take advantage of electronic processes, and they will draft and then distribute or circulate those agendas via an email, or maybe they'll pop it on a website and direct traffic there. Nothing's printed out. Paper is no longer distributed. But that transaction of public business, that agenda process, is now completely electronic. And so those records surrounding that process will need to be retained. Another example of born digital versus digitization or the execution of business is, say, for instance, you're a school district and you get a request to change a student's address. Someone fills out a form, submits it to the front office. Somebody then takes that information captured in that form and does data entry into a database. That form is your evidence and the authority to make those changes. Let's face it, anybody with access can do anything they want into a database. So in order to protect the agency and protect the students and protect the teachers and everybody else involved, you have to keep that form. But this is a great opportunity to go ahead and scan that form in, make that part of the database, authorizing that transaction. So I'm hoping people kind of see a little and understand a little more about how scanning and tossing can help you bridge that gap. Now, I work with a number of school boards that are going paperless. There are software applications out there that have been developed that support nothing but more than boards and commission meetings and things like that, official public meetings. Everything is done and transacted through that software. Some districts have gone completely paperless, and that's great. We support that completely. There again, all the business is generated, captured, and supported electronically. No paper is used whatsoever, and they documented that. The board actually passed a resolution that that's how they're doing business. Although, let's face it, there's still a lot of paper. And yes, that is a real-life picture from somebody's human's desk. And I feel bad for this person, but they're not alone. So the burning question, can I scan and toss paper-based records? Absolutely. There's a couple of conditions attached to that, though. You can scan and toss paper-based records as long as you meet the rules and requirements in accordance with Chapter 434.663, which is the WAC for Imaging System Standards. How many of you knew there are actually some standards? Just going to ask that question. You can either answer in chat or show me a show of hands. There's a few of you. Yeah. Perfect. We love it when people know these things. We don't necessarily require you to read them front and forward and memorize them. However, according to WAC 434.663, you just can't do it. As it says here, conversion to an imaging system does not automatically authorize the destruction of the source documents for which the images have been created. However, we've developed some processes and requirements to enable you to do that. First thing you need to know, those records must be eligible for destruction. There must be an appropriate and approved record series for agency use. And the first thing to look at is, are those records non-archival? Now the good news is any non-archival record series is eligible for what we call scanning and tossing. In other words, capturing the image, verifying it, and then having a shredding party. If you do not know where to find out if those records are non-archival or not, look to your retention schedules. As you see here on the screen, there are designations in the one column. Every single record series has a designation of whether it's non-archival or whether it's archival. So like I said before, any non-archival record is absolutely eligible to scan and toss with great abandon. Go for it. However, before you get really carried away, there's a couple little things we need to point out. Archival records are not to be destroyed. What we're asking agencies to do, if you do have an archival record series you want to scan, please go ahead. We love that. And then contact the archives for appraisal and possible transfer of either the paper, the digital version, or both. We're just as much aware as everybody else that the world is going electronic. However, sometimes archival records, there's an actual value with the paper it comes with. For example, yes, we can scan in a copy of the state constitution. We can scan in, as pictured here, the actual original document establishing Kittitas County. The paper that this information is on has an archival value as well as the information contained within. However, for certain archival records, not so much. The information is what's archival, and the paper, yes, it matters, but not to the level where we want to start keeping the paper for a long period of time. So that's what we encourage people. Call us as you're going in. Let us know, talk to us, and then we'll make the determinations whether we want both or the electronic version only. Part of the catch to maintaining a scanned image is the understanding that if you want to replace that paper with a scanned image, you have to maintain that image along with any indexing information for the entire minimum required retention period. Those images as records must remain readable, searchable, retrievable, and authentic throughout that entire period of time. Now, for some records, that's not a big fat hairy deal. But for other records, that's something you have to consider moving forward. Let's face it, technology and longevity don't belong in the same sentence. And if you're relying on that image, that's your public record. And it must be readable and accessible for the entire period of time you're required to keep it. And that's a bit of a hat trick with certain types of records. It is critical that you develop and document written standards and consistent processes for imaging so that everyone's doing the same way the same thing all the time, again and again, in order to preserve and keep the integrity of that information. Your vendors need to know this too. Your vendors need to know that they have to abide by the same rules and requirements if they're doing work on behalf of your agency. Make sure you've got legal language in those contracts stating that, yes, they're imaging, and they're imaging to the requirements, and that any images that are produced on behalf of the agency must be accessible, retrievable. If something goes south or the contract ends, you have to get all that information and all that data back intact in an accessible form so that you can carry on just like nothing happened. You need to also apply appropriate migration strategies to ensure that anybody can recover those records and metadata that have not met their retention requirements. When you're talking about scanning and tossing, your quality control needs to begin at the beginning. I mean, how many of you gotten an image that was sent to you in an email as an attachment, and maybe you didn't get all the pages? Maybe you got pages 2 through 8 and not the odd-numbered pages. How many times have you maybe gotten something that looks a little bit crumpled? You've got bent pages, or maybe the corner was bent. Maybe someone just overlooked a staple and it went through the scanner and just messed everything up. One good idea is to scan all your documents at a minimum of 300 dpi. The imaging standard WAC 434663 has some breakdowns for, lower fonts and so on and so forth, but just go the safe side. Just assume everything should be scanned in at 300 dpi, you'll be good to go. As part of your quality control, make determinations. How are you doing comparisons to make sure you have a complete and accurate capture? Are you going to do individual visual checks? Are you going to take advantage of the technology to do batch checking, error checks, and so on and so forth? These are all things you need to consider if you're looking to scan and toss appropriately. The technology has improved so much that a lot of your enhancements and manipulations can be done through the software. But you need to look at what needs to be employed and what needs to be looked at. And it's not a bad idea to use scanning targets if you're doing large batches, just to make sure that everything's checked, double-checked. You don't want to be in a position of having to redo anything down the road. Make sure that you do have the appropriate indexing and metadata. Again, you don't want to be stuck having to redo thousands of images. True life story. I was invited over to an agency. They had just completed a major scanning project. They were very happy and proud. I went in there. They brought up these images on a screen, hundreds of them in this lovely folder. Someone didn't think about indexing. So there were rows upon rows of these lovely images, and the only identifier was the unique scanner applied number. That was it. I felt really bad for them. I kind of said, well, somebody needs to go back and index these images. You don't want to have to click on every single one of them to see what it is. There again, it's a true life story. It was one of those, oops, people just didn't understand. If you cannot get a complete and accurate legible copy, say for instance you've got this document, you need to capture the information, but maybe a cup of coffee was spilled on it or something happened, go ahead and create the image, label it or tag it as best scan possible, and then keep the original. The auditor's office really feels strongly about that, as do we. You'll always want the validation of verification that, yeah, we tried, and this is what the original looks like. So if you're ever going through an audit, or if there's any question or it's challenged, you've got the real reason why. Now, we preach all the time that format doesn't matter. And it doesn't. Public record is regardless of physical format characteristics, and including such copies thereof, and so on. When it comes to dealing with images, though, format can matter. So part of our requirements are that if you've got a record with a total retention requirement of 6 years or less, go ahead and image those with any acceptable lossy or lossless format, including PDFs, PDFA, JPEGs, or TIFFs. We like to warn people about that little bit of verbiage with total retention requirements. For example, contracts and agreements have a 6-year retention requirement. The cutoff or the trigger, though, can expand that 6 years to a good long period of time. For contracts and agreements, you keep it for 6 years after termination of the instrument or conclusion or whatever. Well, some contracts go on for 30 years or more. How many of you have 30-year mortgages? So the reality is that total retention requirement is going to look like 36 years as opposed to 6 years. So we want agencies to be aware of that, that fine print when the retention schedules. Make sure you take the total retention requirement into consideration. Currently, and I know people scream out loud when I start talking about long-term records and imaging. If you have a total retention requirement longer than 6 years, you must scan those using a truly lossless data compression format. In other words, TIFF, Group 4, PNG, or GIF. And before people start raising their hands and screaming out loud in their offices, with long-term retention requirements for images, remember you're dealing with technology. Technology is not stable. It just isn't. It's just the way of the world. And so in order to ensure sustainability and searchability of those images for long-term records, image and capture at least a copy of it to Group 4. Now, this is being taken into consideration. We're working with our digital archives and we're looking at allowing PDFAs. There's still a lot of testing going on. There's still a lot of comparison. The main thing is you just have to consider long-term processes and long-term ramifications using technology. I mean, it just speaks to the time. Not too long ago, people were using cassette tapes and floppy disk. I mean, how many of you still have those lovely plastic little 3x5 discs or 3x3 discs in your offices? And do any of you still have the drives to access that information? I mean, my first car had an 8-track tape player, and I loved that. But leaving a tape in a hot car for a long period of time, journey never sounded the same again. CDs are going the way of the dinosaurs. So that's why we really ask people to think really hard about your future access and retention requirements and base your decisions on stability and longevity. Now I'm going to throw out another term that doesn't get used a lot these days, and people also kind of look at me cross-eyed. Not a bad idea to consider microfilm for some of your long-term records. Microfilm and paper are very stable, but nobody wants to deal with paper anymore, I get that. But microfilm is very stable. You can still read film from the Prussian War 300 years ago, and technically speaking, it's technology independent. To access information on a roll of film, you just need a light source, and if you're like me, I carry a pair of magnifiers with me all the time. Technology is there. You can generate film very easily and fairly economically from scanned images. Just upload those things, get the roll of film going on, you're good to go. Then the reverse is true. Images can be written from film for restoration and access if something goes south. And bonus, the state archives will inspect and store your microfilm for free. It's just a little bit of an insurance policy. Yes, you can have backups upon your backups and your backups, but for certain types of records, you might want to consider film. Ideal candidates would be like your retirement records. I mean, those you have to keep for 60 years. and your cutoff doesn't kick in until someone leaves service. Student records are another good candidate for film. Those are a 100-year record, and they are not archival. Come to think of it, retirement records are not archival either. So in the interests of longevity and stability, take a look at perhaps having some film generated for those types of records. Like I said before, payroll records, official student records, as-builts, anything that has a long-term retention requirement for the total. And not a bad idea for essential records to have a copy of those generated in film. Let's face it, disasters do happen. In fact, the archives last spring had our own very own flood. It just is what it is, something to consider as you're planning your processes. Now, we can't really have a discussion about technology and imaging and indexing without talking a little tiny bit about metadata. And I love the most common description that's used. It's data about the data. But what a lot of people don't understand is metadata actually establishes and preserves the authenticity of that electronic record. Metadata is what provides the proof and integrity of that electronic document, bit of business, database, whatever the case may be. Not only that, you can leverage metadata and really make it a tool to help it facilitate access, retrieval, and managing of your images. Imaging requires consistent indexing and metadata for identification. There again, if you've got a record series you're looking to image and you're wanting to shred the paper, you have to think about what do people look for now. You have to think about what other people in the future may want to look. You kind of have to think in terms of if someone needs to Google this information, what's going to be your lowest common denominator so that people can access and find this information in the future. There's a couple of ways you can just kind of analyze your business process and establish those conventions. Take some cues from your paper records. If you've had for years now established central files for your paper, look to that. Someone's thought about establishing those conventions for filing the paper. You need to take that same approach when it comes to imaging and your processes so you can access and retrieve this information. You can do this fairly easily, like I said, but it does take some thought. People just think differently. We're all humans, and humans just tend to think differently. A good example is if I said Paul Newman, what would you think about? I mean, let's just ask some questions here. When I say Paul Newman, what do some of you think? Go ahead and put it in chat. I'm going to do a little bit of an exercise here. Yeah, actor. That's one. Some people think of Paul Newman in association with salad dressing. Cool Hand Luke, movies. So I like using Paul Newman as an example because you've got some generational differences as to how people would Google Paul Newman. And I like to use this as an exercise that things can change. Paul Newman primarily was known and started life as an actor. And then as years go by, he got interested in doing charity work. So yeah, he's got a whole line of salad dressings and other food products to support his charity. However, he's also known as a race car driver and pet food. I mean, you name it. So that's where you have to sit down and think of, okay, if you have this one type of record, how are other people going to best locate it in the future? And we do recommend that you establish 5 to 7 fields when you're looking at identifying and scanning and then indexing those images. Like I said, you can't even think, you have to think, you know, past, present, and future tense when you're developing metadata and indexing standards. We really like ounces of prevention. Being proactive costs a whole lot less and saves a whole lot more time than being reactive. Establish new security protocols, designate approved users, do regular system checks, perform checksums and error checking, develop a disaster plan. Now that one is actually sadly lacking in a lot of organizations. They may have disaster plans for the building and the humans, but sometimes people overlook the records aspect. You can't run a business without your records. And if you have hundreds of thousands of images and you don't have a plan for something going south, that can lead to some trouble. And when you're thinking about disaster planning and preparedness, yes, backups are great, but make sure you at least have one backup that's securely out of the way, at least 50 miles, to enable access and recovery just in case something happens. That supports more of a natural disaster. Let's face it, if we have a major snow or ice storm, or if there was a flood or something like that, it's going to affect more than your immediate vicinity of a building or a block or more. But I think everybody maybe has heard or maybe experienced technology failure of some kind. So that's where planning maybe some film is a good idea. There again, just do a bit of a business analysis. Look at your retention requirements and plan and plan and plan again. And yes, to answer a question that came up, you absolutely can produce film from scanned images. The technology is there. It's great. Our own imaging services does that all the time. Now, once those images are created, they are subject to all the same rules for records management, public records, public disclosure, and litigation holds. Retention requirements do not change once you've converted a piece of paper to an image. The retention for the paper goes for the same for those images. And we ask people to please disposition those images in the same way you're supposed to do to your paper. Once those images have met retention requirements and met your business needs and are eligible for destruction, have a process in place that you do that. We like to tell people to practice defensible disposition. Not a bad idea to document the destruction of the paper-based records once you've verified image capture. And then when the time comes, document destruction of the images once those have been met. What that does is it closes the loop. You know, records have a life cycle. And if you've changed the cycle a little bit, it's important that you document what happened. So you want to document, yes, this point in date, say December 31st, 2014, we destroyed this batch of records that have been imaged. Boom. It lets people know what happened. And that's what defensible disposition is all about, is being able to defend your actions and defend, if you're hauled into court, what happened. Because sometimes the judges ask that, what happened? And they get a little cranky if you can't give them a good answer. And things like, well, it's too hard, or we didn't think about it, meh. Any of those reactions standing in front of a judge are probably going to be viewed somewhat dimly. Any questions? We have a 6-page document called the Requirements for the Destruction of Non-Archival Paper Records After Imaging, also referred to as Scanning and Tossing, available at this link. As a bonus, there is a checklist on page 2. Take that checklist, go through it. If you have yes checked for every one of those boxes, you are good to go. The nice thing about this document, if you have a no, it directs you to the paragraph why it needs to be a yes. And another helpful hint is while you're going through that checklist, imagine yourself standing in front of an auditor or a judge with your hand on your heart, and if you can comfortably say yes to all of the above, you're well poised to go ahead and image and toss to your heart's content. Any questions? Have I just stunned everybody into silence? Well, that wraps up the webinar on scanning and tossing. Oh, yes, the Skidia Kent. Well, if you go back to that one page, the old EIS data approval process turned out to be quite the effort. And yes, the City of Kent was one of the first adopters of the authority to be able to scan and toss on a broad scale. And actually, the City of Kent, I'm going to give you a shout out. You guys did the right thing. I worked with your IT person at the time, and I'm not sure if Ronald is the one. And we have a question. They are switching to a new EDM system. Do you need to recertify our new system? Well, the reality is we never certified anybody's system. The old DAD process, or the EIS process, was simply to authorize the agency to scan and toss. We asked questions about people's system because we wanted them to be able to support and do the right thing and meet the requirements, but we've never ever certified any systems. I can't even imagine what that would look like. So anyway, in self-defense, we decided to redo that process, and going forward, people can basically self-authorize using and leveraging that 6-page document. Like I said, read through the checklist. I'm pretty comfortable that the City of Kent will actually have a yes throughout that whole thing. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. Any questions at all? If you think of something after the fact, you can reach out to the email address, recordsmanagement@sos.wa.gov. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We do appreciate it. Please go forth, scan and toss, and organize.